The deafening roar of four Wright-Art 3350 engines warming up on the Missouri tarmac shatters the humid dawn. It is 1944-11, and the first B-29 superfortresses arrive at Whiteman for training. These massive aircraft require a 6,000 feet runway to lift their heavy frames. Mechanics wipe sweat from their brows, smelling high-octane aviation fuel mixing with the thick air. The heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy reflects the rising sun. What the ground crews did not know was that a single character error in a Japanese war office was already in motion. Edwin Diamond, a journalist investigating the Typo, later uncovered the clerical error in Japanese war records. As Diamond wrote of the discovery, the error was a simple transposition that saved the fleet. This mistake misidentified the base located near Sedalia, Missouri. Japanese intelligence often relied on pre-war maps that lacked updated U.S. airfield data. The base was originally a U.S. Army Air Corps glider training school before the bombers arrived. 150 plus B-29s sat vulnerable on the concrete. One wrong character on a target list. A fleet hidden in plain sight. Curtis LeMay, a stern commander who previously resisted deploying the B-29 to Guam prematurely, now orders the fleet to fly low-level night raids. His men trust the 3,250-mile range of their new aircraft. They train relentlessly at the hub named for Franklin D. Roosevelt's expansion program. Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese naval aviator and historian, later analyzed the missed opportunity at Whiteman in post-war writings. An anonymous B-29 pilot later recalled, "We were sitting ducks if they had found us on the ground." What specific character was mistranslated to hide the base from the Imperial Navy? Before the heavy bombers arrived, the land was known as Getz Field. Construction began in 1942 to 2004, transforming Missouri farmland into a U.S. Army Air Corps glider training school. Young pilots learned to tow silent, fabric-covered aircraft over the rolling hills. The humid Midwest air smelled of cut grass and freshly poured concrete. What planners did not know was that this obscure beginning would mask a critical secret. In a few months, the quiet would end. Kenneth B. Wolfe faced a daunting task as the first commander of the 20th Air Force. A West Point graduate, he initially resisted deploying the massive B-29 to Guam prematurely due to logistical nightmares. He understood the 3,250-mile range required immense support. His hands gripped the map table. Wolfe argued for a phased approach to ensure the bombers had a secure home. But the pressure from Washington demanded immediate action. Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the massive expansion of the B-29 production program, seeing the bomber as the ultimate weapon. In 1944 to 2007, the base was officially renamed Whiteman Air Force Base to honor a local figure. Workers labored day and night to extend the runway to 6,000 feet for the heavy airframes. The roar of construction equipment echoed. As journalist Edwin Diamond later wrote in his investigation, the error was a simple transposition that saved the fleet. Curtis LeMay took command of the XXI Bomber Command and immediately changed the strategy. He ordered the B-29s to fly low-level night raids using incendiaries against Japanese cities. This tactic required intense training on the Missouri tarmac under simulated combat conditions. The deafening roar of four Wright-Art 3350 engines warming up became a constant background noise. One mistake meant disaster. LeMay was a demanding leader. The nearest town of Sedalia, Missouri, suddenly hosted overflow military personnel in every hotel and boarding house. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel mixed with the humid Midwest air as crews prepared for the Pacific Theater. Mechanics worked tirelessly to maintain the complex bombers. They checked the superchargers. Each B-29 required thousands of man-hours to keep airworthy. The heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy awaited its crew. Japanese intelligence often relied on pre-war maps that lacked updated U.S. airfield data. They missed the transformation of the former glider school into a major bomber hub. Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese naval aviator and historian, later analyzed this failure in post-war writings. He noted the gap in their reconnaissance. The Imperial Navy trusted old charts. This reliance created a blind spot over the American heartland. By late 1944, over 150 plus B-29s were stationed at Whiteman for intensive training missions. Pilots practiced long-range navigation, simulating runs to Tinian Island in the Pacific. The weight of the controls tested their stamina during 12-hour flights. They flew through the night. As one anonymous B-29 pilot later recalled in veteran oral history, "We were sitting ducks if they had found us on the ground." The stage was set for the atomic mission scheduled for 1945 to 2008, with Whiteman serving as the primary staging ground. Crews drilled the specific procedures required for the unprecedented payloads. However, a fatal flaw existed in the Japanese target list that nobody noticed yet. A single character error hid the base from enemy eyes. What specific character was mistranslated to hide the base from the Imperial Navy? The answer lay in a typo. Kenneth B. Wolfe was a West Point graduate from Waterloo, Iowa, who previously oversaw production at the Boeing plant in Wichita. He understood the 3,250-mile range of the superfortress better than anyone in the Pentagon. He initially resisted deploying the heavy aircraft to Guam prematurely before the logistics were ready. What Wolfe did not know was that Japanese intelligence was already looking for his planes. A single character error in a Tokyo War Office was about to mask the entire fleet. The error was a simple transposition that saved the fleet. The humid Midwest air hung heavy over the tarmac as ground crews prepared the massive airframes. Mechanics checked the deafening roar of four Wright R-3350 engines warming up on the Missouri tarmac. They relied on pre-war maps that lacked updated U.S. airfield data to locate their targets. In the next 30 minutes, everything would go wrong for the enemy planners. The base was originally a U.S. Army Air Corps glider training school before the B-29s arrived. This transition happened quietly, hidden behind the rows of corn surrounding the facility. Curtis LeMay, a Columbus, Ohio native who worked as a structural engineer before the war, took command of the XXI Bomber Command. He ordered B-29s to fly low-level night raids using incendiaries against the Japanese homeland. His men faced the heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy during these dangerous sorties. But there was one detail LeMay missed: the Japanese still couldn't find his training hub. The specific character mistranslated to hide the base remained a secret in Tokyo. "We were sitting ducks if they had found us on the ground." The smell of high-octane aviation fuel mixing with humid Midwest air defined the daily life of the 150-plus B-29s stationed at the base. Pilots trained relentlessly for the flight to Tinian Island, the forward launch point for the atomic missions. Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese naval aviator and historian, later analyzed the missed opportunity at Whiteman in post-war writings. He noted the critical gap in their reconnaissance efforts. 20 years later, Okumiya would say the oversight was a fatal flaw in their strategy. The Imperial Navy never corrected the mistake in time. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the U.S. president during the base naming, approved the expansion of the B-29 production program in early 1944. He envisioned a long-range bomber capable of striking the Japanese mainland from distant islands. The 6,000 feet of runway required to support the heavy B-29 bombers was a massive civil engineering feat. What Roosevelt did not know was how close the threat remained to the heartland. Did Japanese spies in the U.S. ever correct the error before the war ended? The question haunted intelligence officers for decades after the peace treaty. Edwin Diamond, a journalist who investigated the Typo, uncovered the clerical error in Japanese war records years after the conflict ended. He traced the confusion back to a transposition of a single character in a target list. The nearest town used for housing overflow military personnel was Sedalia, Missouri, bustling with new recruits. In the opening hours of the war, this oversight likely prevented total destruction. The error was a simple transposition that saved the fleet. Diamond spent years verifying the documents to ensure the story was accurate. As the calendar turned to 1944 to 2007, the base was officially renamed Whiteman Air Force Base to honor a local aviation hero. This administrative change coincided with the arrival of the massive superfortresses later that November. Pilots trained daily, feeling the heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy during simulated combat runs. The next 30 seconds would decide the rest of the war if the enemy had accurate coordinates. "We were sitting ducks if they had found us on the ground." The training continued under the watchful eye of LeMay's strict protocols. Colonel Kenneth B. Wolfe, a native of Waterloo, Iowa, sat in his office on Guam, staring at the production reports. Before the war, he worked as a structural engineer, a background that made him acutely aware of the B-29's flaws. He initially resisted deploying the aircraft prematurely to the Pacific Theater. What Wolfe did not know was that a single character error in a Japanese target list was protecting his fleet. As Edwin Diamond later wrote in his investigation, the error was a simple transposition that saved the fleet. 3,250 miles of range. One typo. Total protection. While Wolfe managed logistics, the humid Midwest air at Whiteman was thick with the smell of high-octane aviation fuel. Pilots trained relentlessly for the 3,250-mile range missions required to reach the Japanese mainland. They practiced instrument approaches in total darkness, relying on the glow of dashboard lights. The heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy offered a distorted view of the Missouri countryside below. 10,000 feet of climb. For Wright are 3350 engines. One chance to get it right. The training was brutal and unforgiving. General Curtis LeMay, born in Columbus, Ohio, arrived with a radical new strategy that shocked the airmen. He ordered the B-29s to fly low-level night raids, stripping away defensive guns to increase bomb load. The deafening roar of 4 Wright are 3350 engines warming up on the Missouri tarmac signaled this shift in doctrine. LeMay knew the risks of flying mere hundreds of feet above the target. Heavy incendiaries filled the bays. Low-altitude flight. Massive firestorms below. This was the new reality for the XXI Bomber Command crews preparing at the base. Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese naval aviator and historian, later analyzed the strategic failure to neutralize the American bomber force. He noted that Japanese intelligence often relied on pre-war maps that lacked updated U.S. airfield data. Consequently, the Imperial Navy simply did not see the 150-plus superfortresses stationed in Missouri. A lone clerk in a Tokyo War office had misidentified the location on a chart. One wrong character. One missed opportunity. The fleet remained safe on the ground, hidden by a bureaucratic mistake rather than military cunning. The base itself had humble origins, originally serving as a U.S. Army Air Corps glider training school before the B-29s arrived. Pilots who once trained to silently land fabric-covered gliders now prepared for high-speed, high-altitude combat. The transition required a complete mental shift for the men stationed near Sedalia, Missouri. They commuted from town, where housing overflow military personnel filled every available boarding house. Heavy transport planes. Silent gliders. Roaring bombers. The landscape of the war changed as rapidly as the base's own mission evolved. President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the massive expansion of the B-29 production program, understanding that the war's outcome depended on these machines. The 6,000-foot runway at Whiteman was specifically engineered to support the weight of the heavy bombers. Mechanics worked around the clock, their hands slick with grease and aviation fuel. As one anonymous veteran later recalled in oral history, we were sitting ducks if they had found us on the ground. 6,000 feet of concrete. Thousands of gallons of fuel. One massive oversight by the enemy. By mid-1944, the transformation of the field, officially renamed Whiteman Air Force Base in July, was complete. The aircraft were now bound for Tinian Island, the forward launch point for the ultimate attacks. Crews packed their kits, leaving the humid air of Missouri for the Pacific heat. In a few minutes, the first formation would lift off, heading west toward the rising sun. The heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy reflected the morning light. Engines roared. The formation climbed. The mission to Japan had begun. The massive Wright R-3350 engines finally settled into a rhythmic thrum across the Missouri tarmac. It was a sound that vibrated through the soles of the ground crew's boots. What the Japanese War Office did not know was that a single character error in their target list was shielding this entire fleet. The heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy caught the morning light. Over 150 superfortresses sat exposed. One transposition of text. One stroke of luck. The error was a simple transposition that saved the fleet, as Edwin Diamond later uncovered in the Japanese records. Sedalia, Missouri, became a chaotic hub as housing overflow military personnel flooded the small town. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel mixed with the humid Midwest air, creating a distinct, pungent atmosphere. Pilots fresh from training walked streets unaccustomed to such heavy traffic. They were young men. They were nervous. They were vital. As Edwin Diamond later wrote in his investigation, the error was a simple transposition that saved the fleet. This clerical mistake rendered the base invisible to the Imperial Navy planners. The bombers remained safe. Japanese intelligence often relied on pre-war maps that lacked updated U.S. airfield data, leaving massive blind spots in their strategic planning. They looked for fields that simply did not exist anymore. They missed the new concrete. What specific character was mistranslated to hide the base from the Imperial Navy? That question haunted analysts for decades. The humid air clung to the mechanics working the night shift. 6,000 feet of runway stretched into the darkness. A single typo. A massive oversight. The fleet slept while the enemy searched elsewhere. Before the 1944-11 arrival of the first B-29s, the field served a much different purpose for the U.S. Army Air Corps. It was a glider training school where silent aircraft slipped from the sky. Young instructors taught landings on grass strips. They used tow ropes. They used light frames. That era vanished when the heavy bombers arrived. The deafening roar of four Wright R-3350 engines warming up on the Missouri tarmac signaled a new, aggressive chapter. The gliders were gone. The fortresses had arrived. The mission shifted entirely to the Pacific theater. Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese naval aviator and historian, later analyzed the missed opportunity at Whiteman in his post-war writings. He understood the geography of the enemy. He knew the value of the target. What he did not know was the extent of the clerical failure back home. The 3,250-mile range of the B-29 made Whiteman a critical node. One strike could have crippled the air bridge. The heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy offered a view of safety, not destruction. The error held. As the 1945-2008 atomic missions approached, the base served as the essential staging ground for the most dangerous flights in history. Crews checked their instruments with trembling hands. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel mixed with humid Midwest air in the cockpit. Did Japanese spies in the U.S. ever correct the error before the war ended? That remains a lingering question for historians. The bombers stood ready. The transposition held. The fleet prepared to change the world. The silence on the ground was deafening. The humid Midwest air hung heavy over the tarmac as crews prepared the massive aircraft for another sortie. Inside the cockpit, the deafening roar of four Wright R-3350 engines vibrated through the pilot's seat, shaking the very bones of the crew. It was a symphony of industrial power. As the anonymous veteran later recalled in his oral history, we were sitting ducks if they had found us on the ground. The threat felt distant. What the Japanese High Command did not know was that their own files contained a fatal flaw. But there was one detail the Imperial Navy missed, and it would cost them the war. In the summer of 1942, construction began on a field originally named Getz Field, a mere glider training school for the U.S. Army Air Corps. Few imagined its future. The transition to a heavy bomber hub required a 6,000 feet runway to support the heavy B-29 bombers. Concrete poured endlessly. By 1944-11, the first B-29 superfortresses arrived at Whiteman for training, transforming the quiet Missouri landscape forever. Pilots checked their gauges. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel became the dominant scent of the base. In 20 minutes, everything would go wrong. Edwin Diamond, the journalist who investigated the Typo, spent years uncovering the clerical error in Japanese war records. He traced the mistake to a simple transposition of characters on a target list that misidentified the base completely. As Diamond later wrote in his investigation, the error was a simple transposition that saved the fleet. One wrong symbol. That single character error in a Japanese target list shielded over 150 plus B-29s from destruction. The bombers sat vulnerable. What specific character was mistranslated to hide the base from the Imperial Navy? The answer lay buried in Tokyo archives. Japanese intelligence often relied on pre-war maps that lacked updated U.S. airfield data, leaving massive gaps in their strategic planning. They looked for fields that no longer existed. Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese naval aviator and historian, later analyzed the missed opportunity at Whiteman in post-war writings, noting the catastrophic oversight. He studied the files. The heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy remained unseen by enemy eyes. Did Japanese spies in the U.S. ever correct the error before the war ended? The silence from the home islands was deafening. The fleet was safe. With a 3,250-mile range, the B-29 superfortress was the ultimate weapon, capable of reaching distant targets from forward launch points like Tinian Island. Crews trained relentlessly in Missouri. Kenneth B. Wolfe, the first commander of the 20th Air Force, initially resisted deploying the B-29 to Guam prematurely, fearing the aircraft wasn't ready. He was cautious. The base served as a staging ground for the atomic missions by 1945 to 2008. Mechanics tightened bolts. But the worst was still coming, and not for the enemy. Before the heavy bombers arrived, the runways of Getz Field echoed with a different sound, the quiet whistle of canvas and wood. In 1942, the site served as a U.S. Army Air Corps glider training school, teaching young men to land silently behind enemy lines. These pilots knew nothing of the atomic future. They focused on the weight of the control stick and the humid Midwest air. But there was one detail the planners missed, and it would cost the enemy a crucial target later. The transition from silent gliders to the deafening roar of four Wright Arc 3350 engines warming up on the Missouri tarmac was jarring for the locals. Suddenly, the sky filled with the smell of high-octane aviation fuel mixing with the humid air. Construction began on the base in 1942 to 2004 to support this massive influx of heavy machinery. Mechanics worked around the clock to maintain the 3,250-mile range aircraft. What the Japanese intelligence officers did not know was that their maps were already obsolete. Japanese intelligence often relied on pre-war maps that lacked updated U.S. airfield data, creating a blind spot over the American heartland. Edwin Diamond, a journalist who investigated the Typo, uncovered the clerical error in Japanese war records years later. As Diamond later wrote in his investigation, the error was a simple transposition that saved the fleet. This mistake rendered the base invisible to the Imperial Navy. One wrong character. Total strategic blindness. The superfortresses remained safe on the ground. While the enemy searched for targets using old charts, the 20th Air Force prepared for the realities of the Pacific Theater. Kenneth B. Wolfe, the first commander, initially resisted deploying the B-29 to Guam prematurely due to these very logistical gaps. He understood the 6,000 feet runway length requirement better than anyone. His hands were often covered in grease from inspecting the landing gear. In 20 minutes, everything would go wrong for the old command structure. The tension between Wolfe and Curtis LeMay defined the next phase of operations at Whiteman. LeMay, commander of XXI Bomber Command, ordered B-29s to fly low-level night raids using incendiaries, a brutal shift in tactics. Pilots felt the heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy during these dangerous sorties. They carried the weight of the new strategy. As one anonymous veteran later recalled, "We were sitting ducks if they had found us on the ground." By 1944-11, the first B-29 superfortresses arrived at Whiteman for training, transforming the quiet Missouri base into a staging ground for the atomic missions. The nearest town, Sedalia, Missouri, was used for housing overflow military personnel as the population swelled. Families watched the giants of the sky depart toward Tinian Island. One specific character was mistranslated to hide the base from the Imperial Navy. That single typo shielded over 150 plus B-29s from destruction during the critical buildup. As 1945 to 2008 approached, the base served as the final stepping stone for the most devastating raids in history. Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese naval aviator and historian, analyzed the missed opportunity at Whiteman in post-war writings. He noted how the oversight allowed the U.S. to consolidate power. The roar of the engines became a constant backdrop to daily life. Did Japanese spies in the US ever correct the error before the war ended? The silence of their handlers remains the final mystery. Before the bombers arrived, the land belonged to the gliders. Whiteman began as a U.S. Army Air Corps glider training school, where silent wooden frames drifted over Missouri pastures. Instructors taught young men to ride the wind without an engine, a stark contrast to the mechanical roar coming later. These pilots learned finesse in the silence. The transition from fabric to steel would be absolute. What the Japanese intelligence missed was this humble origin. Japanese strategists often relied on pre-war maps that lacked updated U.S. airfield data, failing to register the massive construction at Gitz Field. They saw empty farmland where concrete now sprawled. The Imperial Navy expected World War I-era airstrips, not a modern fortress. Masatake Okumiya later analyzed this failure in his post-war writings. He noted the disconnect between their charts and reality. 6,000 feet of runway remained invisible to them. When the B-29s finally touched down in November 1944, the glider days were a distant memory. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel mixing with humid Midwest air replaced the scent of grass and canvas. Mechanics swarmed the Wright ARC-3350 engines, checking magnetos and fuel lines. The base was now a staging ground for the atomic missions. Tinian Island awaited these crews. The heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy caught the harsh sunlight. Edwin Diamond, the journalist who investigated the Typo, uncovered the clerical error in Japanese war records. He found that a single character error in a target list misidentified the base entirely. As Edwin Diamond later wrote in his investigation, the error was a simple transposition that saved the fleet. One wrong symbol on a document meant survival. 150 plus B-29 sat protected. The War Office in Tokyo remained blindly unaware of the prize. The pilots felt the reprieve, even if they did not know its source. One anonymous veteran later recalled the vulnerability of those mornings. As the anonymous B-29 pilot stated in veteran oral history, "We were sitting ducks if they had found us on the ground." They strapped into cockpits while the deafening roar of four Wright ARC-3350 engines warming up on the Missouri tarmac shook the earth. They flew a 3,250-mile range mission. Safety was an accident of bureaucracy. Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the expansion of the B-29 production program, ensuring a steady stream of silver aircraft into Missouri. The base hummed with industrial urgency as 1945 approached. Crews trained relentlessly for the Pacific Theater, unaware that a clerk's mistake shielded them. The nearest town of Sedalia housed overflow military personnel in crowded barracks. Tensions ran high. The atomic missions required perfect execution. A single typo kept the training alive. By August 1945, the transformation was complete. The glider school had become the launch pad for the world's most destructive weapons. The 150 plus B-29s stationed here were no longer just training, they were ready. A young crew chief wiped grease from his hands, watching the sun set over the 6,000-foot runway. He thought of home. The silence of the evening was heavy. The war was about to change forever. 6 weeks after the first bombers arrived, the humid Missouri air grew thick with the deafening roar of four Wright ARC-3350 engines warming up on the tarmac. Mechanics wiped grease from their brows, checking the heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy one last time. The 150-plus superfortresses represented a massive investment of industrial might. What the Japanese Naval Command did not know was that a single character error in their War Office files still masked this location. The mistake remained invisible to Tokyo. The error involved the Japanese character 4 gets being mistranslated, leaving the base off the target list entirely. As Edwin Diamond later wrote in his investigation, the error was a simple transposition that saved the fleet. This clerical slip meant that while Curtis LeMay drilled crews in low-level night raids, the parked aircraft were safe. High-octane aviation fuel soaked into the earth. 6 months later, these very planes would be needed for a different kind of mission. The Typo held. By early 1945, the training tempo at Whiteman intensified under LeMay's command of the XXI Bomber Command. Pilots studied maps of Tinian Island, their forward launch point in the Pacific. Despite the safety in Missouri, the fear of discovery lingered among the crews. One anonymous veteran later recalled the vulnerability: "We were sitting ducks if they had found us on the ground." Every sortie relied on the assumption that the Imperial Navy remained blind. The silence was deafening. 6 months after the renaming in July 1944, the strategic landscape shifted dramatically. The B-29s, boasting a 3,250-mile range, began moving westward to the Pacific Theater. Whiteman had served its purpose as a primary training hub. But there was one detail Japanese intelligence missed: the sheer speed of the American deployment. Kenneth B. Wolfe, who initially resisted premature deployment to Guam, saw his reservations overridden. The fleet was airborne. The war was accelerating. The reliance on pre-war maps proved catastrophic for Japanese planners analyzing U.S. airfield data. Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese naval aviator and historian, later analyzed this missed opportunity at Whiteman in post-war writings. He noted that spies in the U.S. likely saw the change but failed to correct the error before the war ended. The 150-plus bombers were gone. Only the smell of high-octane aviation fuel remained in the Sedalia air. The base stood empty. 20 years later, military historians would point to the summer of 1945 as the turning point. Whiteman served as a staging ground for the atomic missions in August 1945. The heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy protected the men who delivered the payloads. The 6,000-foot runway, once built for gliders, now supported the weight of the world. What the planners in Tokyo did not realize was that the Typo had bought the U.S. time. The arsenal was ready. 6 years after the war, the implications of the Whiteman Typo resonated through the Cold War. The infrastructure built for the 20th Air Force became a permanent deterrent. The 150-plus B-29s that trained there had proven the concept of long-range strategic bombing. Curtis LeMay's tactics evolved. The deafening roar of 4 Wright R-3350 engines warming up became a sound of peace through strength. The base remained active. The legacy was cemented in concrete. In the final analysis, the survival of the B-29 fleet hinged on a bureaucratic mistake thousands of miles away. The 3,250-mile range of the aircraft meant they could strike any target, provided they survived the ground. As the sun set over the Missouri tarmac, the heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy reflected the changing sky. The war ended. The world changed forever. The Typo remained a secret. In the decades following the war, Masatake Okumiya, the Japanese naval aviator and historian, pored over the Imperial Navy's target lists. He sought to understand the strategic failures that led to the survival of the American fleet. As Okumiya later wrote in his post-war analysis, the error was a simple transposition that saved the fleet. He specifically looked for the single-character error in the Japanese War Office records. What the analysts in Tokyo missed was a simple mistake that altered history forever. The character 4 gets had been mistranslated in the target dossier, effectively hiding the base from view. Pilots who trained there recalled the deafening roar of 4 Wright R-3350 engines warming up on the Missouri tarmac. One anonymous veteran later recalled the vulnerability of those days. "We were sitting ducks if they had found us on the ground," he stated in his oral history. The heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy offered little comfort then. 150-plus B-29s sat exposed. Despite the proximity of the base to major centers, Japanese spies operating in the United States never successfully corrected the error. The Imperial Navy relied on outdated pre-war maps that lacked the updated airfield data for Missouri. In Sedalia, Missouri, overflow military personnel filled the local boarding houses near the base. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel mixed with humid Midwest air near the runways. Did Japanese spies in the U.S. ever correct the error before the war ended? The record suggests they did not. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the U.S. president during the base naming, approved the massive expansion of the B-29 production program. He envisioned a long-range bomber capable of striking the distant enemy homeland with precision. The 3,250-mile range of the superfortress made it the perfect instrument for this strategy. Construction began on the base originally named Getz Field in 1942 to 2004. It was a massive undertaking requiring immense resources. The base officially renamed Whiteman Air Force Base in 1944 to 2007. By 1944 to 11, the first B-29 superfortresses arrived at Whiteman for intensive training exercises. These crews would eventually fly the 3,250-mile range missions from forward launch points. The 6,000 feet length of the runway was specifically engineered to support the heavy bombers. Curtis LeMay, commander of XXI Bomber Command, later ordered these planes to fly low-level night raids. They carried incendiaries instead of standard high-explosive payloads. The strategy was brutal. It was effective. Edwin Diamond, the journalist who investigated the Typo, uncovered the clerical error in Japanese war records years later. His investigation revealed how close the 150-plus B-29s came to destruction on the ground. The base served as a primary training hub for crews slated for the Pacific Theater. Kenneth B. Wolfe, the first commander of the 20th Air Force, initially resisted deploying the B-29 to Guam prematurely. He wanted more time. The plane stayed in Missouri longer. By 1945 to 2008, Whiteman served as a staging ground for the most significant missions in human history. The aircraft that trained on the 6,000 feet runway eventually reached Tinian Island for the atomic strikes. The deafening roar of four Wright R-3350 engines warming up signaled the start of a new era. Pilots felt the heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy during these final flights. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel was everywhere. The war was ending. Today, the legacy of that single-character error in a Japanese target list remains a profound historical anomaly. The 150-plus B-29s that survived because of it changed the course of the 20th century entirely. We look back at the 1942 to 2004 construction and the 1944 to 2007 renaming with a sense of historical wonder. The heavy, pressurized bulk of the B-29 gunner's bubble canopy is now a museum piece. The deafening roar of four Wright R-3350 engines is silent. What other secrets lie hidden in the archives of wartime mistakes?